Um, what I want to cover today is the period from about 1848 to 1914. It's an interesting period because there's an enormous jump in the population. In 1850, the population was 23 million. By 1900, it was 76 million. And a whole lot of new states came into being. And the West Coast, which I want to sort of look at, because somebody asked me last week about Washington and Oregon. And it's also the period from 1877 to 1914 is the period Americans call the Gilded Age. And that's when my mum and dad used to call them plutocrats. People like J.P. Morgan, Rockefeller, Carnegie, they'd be the billionaires of today, started to make their fortune. But it was also an interesting period because you had the Spanish-American War in 1898. Also, as I touched on it last week, the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882. So quite a lot of things happening during this period. So it was also this idea, which we're still sort of seeing again with Trump and his MAGA obsession. Back in the late 19th century, they called it manifest destiny. That was the phrase they used to use, that the United States, this was when they were pushing west across the Rockies to the west coast, and the opening up of the Oregon Trail and so on, and the final fix with the border with Canada, and the sort of creation, the growth of California. So it was a very interesting period. So jumping around a little bit, the one thing I didn't touch on last week was Monroe Doctrine. That's got its name. It's actually 1823, but that was when the president Monroe, and that's where Monrovia, the capital of Liberia, got its name from. And what it basically stated was that the European powers were obliged to recognize that the Western Hemisphere was the US sphere of interest. That's Monroe Doctrine to this day. It's interesting. You sort of look at China's challenge to the United States at the moment, which is probably sort of roughly the same implication. This is our sphere of interest. No, says the United States, and drags us into it. So it's an old idea, this idea of what is a sphere of interest. You can see, so what I want to look at is how some of these states came into being. So you had the Civil War. I don't need to go into the details because we're not here to talk about that. It was basically when the southern states tried to secede, the Confederation, and the North said no. And the implications were quite interesting for Europe, particularly cotton. When the cotton started coming, by 1860, incidentally, there were about 4 million slaves in the United States. So the current Afro-American population, which is around 12 to 13% in the United States, sort of goes back to that period. Because of that, the British, that's when they began to develop cotton in Egypt and India. So interesting implications there. And of course the Suez Canal was opened in 1869, just after the US Civil War. So a lot of big shifts in trade patterns, which are quite interesting. And you have to remember that Britain, in particular with the Industrial Revolution, particularly cotton and textile exports, were very important during this period. So there was a sort of overflow from the US Civil War. So it's quite what I wanted to look at very quickly was just when some of these states came into being, because these all came into being, there's over a dozen of them, after the Civil War. So the Civil War was sort of basically this area. Here's Nebraska. That became a state in 1867. Colorado, here. This is where the Rocky Mountains are. And that was 1876. And then you hear quite a lot about North and South Dakota. That name comes from the Lakota people, the indigenous population. That was 1889. There were a whole lot of new states created in 1889. Montana, if any of you have been across the US, there's Montana. Very sparsely populated, very cold in the winter. Now, the other changes were over here. So California had sort of been admitted bit by bit after the gold rush, 1848 onwards. But a lot of these states were only admitted in parts, and then they sort of extended themselves. And there was a lot of border disputes as well, but we don't need to go into those. So Washington state here was formally declared a state in 1889, and then Idaho next to it, this funny shape, that was the year after in 1890. And then the most sparsely populated state in the US, Wyoming, here, that became a state in 1890. So there's a whole lot of new states around that period. And I told you last week when we were talking about the Church of Jesus Christ and the Latter-day Saints, otherwise known as the Mormons, as I said to you, they don't like being called that. Here's the state of Utah. That was admitted when they finally agreed that they would only have one wife, 1896. But as I told you last week, there's a whole lot of naughty Mormons living out in the backwoods who have quite a few more than one. Oklahoma, which we hear about occasionally here, that wasn't admitted, as it says, till 1907. This is where the bits that were sort of taken from Mexico finally formalized into different states. New Mexico, here, didn't become a state till 1912. New Mexico, of course, was where the United States tested its first nuclear weapons. I don't know if you know the story. After the Manhattan Project, they sort of got it all together, and then the war in Europe ended in April 1945, and they sat down and discussed, well, Hitler never did have a bomb, so what are we going to do with the one that we've made here? And they had a big debate about what to do, and the big argument, well, the war with Japan's still going on. We could drop it on an island in the Pacific and scare the Japanese, but in the end they made the decision, as you know, to sort of target a couple of the cities that still hadn't been bombed. They wanted to see what it would do to an unbombed city, which is why they didn't bomb Tokyo. We're coming to the islands in the Pacific that they used for that later on, which is still part of the US, including, of course, Bikini Atoll. But the first test was actually here in New Mexico. Again, on indigenous land. It's another long story, that. They didn't know what was going to happen. They even thought the whole world would be blown up. They hadn't the slightest idea what was going to happen. Some of you may have seen the story. So that's where they tested it. And then it was fairly obvious it wasn't a good idea to test nuclear weapons on US territory, which is why they switched to the Pacific. And we'll talk about the Pacific Islands they used for that next week. And finally, the one we often hear about now, Arizona. Arizona's in the news a lot because a lot of the people fleeing violence in Central and South America come across the border here. Here's this border here. And some of you may have seen I think it was the Four Corners program about the vigilantes in Arizona who drive up and down the border looking for illegal immigrants, and Trump's wall. So that's quite an important border. This border with Texas, of course, is a river, the Rio Grande, but here is where the wall is. So Arizona didn't join until 1912. It's also the home, I know some of you remember Barry Goldwater, that's where he came from. So the other two we're going to look at is the story behind Alaska and Hawaii. The other one I hadn't touched on was, because this is where there was a sort of lot of confusion on the West Coast. California was actually formally admitted in 1850. As I said, it was part of Mexico, And then after the war with Mexico, the different sort of states emerged. But that's why you've got all these Spanish-sounding names like San Francisco and San Diego. Oregon, here's the state of Oregon. Again, only part of it joined. They never formalized the borders for quite a while. In 1859, what was happening during this period was that in the 1840s, and this is the period some of you may remember reading about the wagon trails, and they were basically, the big issue was crossing the Rockies. So there were these trails they were exploring, and the Oregon Trail, as it was known, was the one that sort of came over here and finally ended up with the state of Oregon. And then Washington, 1889, as I said. What they were interested in mostly here, and where they finally sort of formalized this border here with Canada, was the fur trade. I've talked about the fur trade before, particularly when I talked about Russian expansion across through Alaska and then down to California, and the creation of the Russian, it's just sort of north of San Francisco, Fort Ross. You just got to remember how cold it is. I remember my mum telling me about how we had distant cousins who'd emigrated to, I can't remember which state in Canada, Alberta or Saskatchewan, dropping to -60 in the winter. It really is fiendishly cold. Even when I was traveling across Canada in the winter, my beard froze. I still remember it. And it sort of turned white. And if your nose dribbled, it's turned to ice. But cold is intense. And when you touch something, some of you may know, you can burn yourself, touch iron or something. So you can see the importance of the fur trade. And the trade here was more on sea otters, and then further north, sort of the bears and so on. So it's important to remember, again, trade. What were they trading in? Well, obviously it was the gold rush here, and then further north, the fur trade. But again, negotiating with indigenous people, that sort of finalized, not quite, by 1912, then you've got 48 states. So now we come up to, the other thing I meant to mention to you, people sort of say, don't understand the American electoral system. Trouble is, it's like our constitution. It was fixed at the beginning and we don't seem to be able to change it. At least we're allowed to vote on it, although we keep voting not to change it. But the Democrats were formed in 1828, and the Republican Party 1854. And the interesting thing is the change. The Democrats were always associated with the South, and the Republicans with the North, and particularly business interests here. Look at the switch. It's fascinating. So now the Democrats are being condemned as sort of lefties, woke, and all kinds of silly abusive terms. And Trump and the Republicans, it's completely changed. But when you sort of compare it to our political parties, it's very hard to make sense. I used to ask my friends in the United States, how the heck do you decide who to vote for? And they said, you vote what mum and dad used to vote. It's just, there isn't really any difference. I think that's changed. That's something maybe we can look about next week. But I just thought I'd mention that's when those two major political parties, there were others, but that's when they were founded. Then the other thing I wanted to touch on was this border with Canada. The Anglo-American Convention of 1818 fixed that it's the 49th parallel. Spain had ceded its rights up to the 42nd parallel, but they were fixing the border here with Washington and Oregon, and of course you've got this funny little loop around Vancouver Island, and there's still a couple of little islands that Canada and the US dispute. The other territory disputes they've still got dispute with Maine, a couple of little islands there that they still argue about. So they haven't sort of finally fixed everything to do with the border. So we come to 1898, and the Spanish-American War. That war was out. Here's Cuba, sort of not quite on the map, but that's what it is. And it was still Spanish. There was an argument between the US and Spain. The Spanish sank an American battleship, so they went to war. This was the time of Teddy Roosevelt. And this was important because the US now acquired 3 new overseas territories. Now, the US doesn't have colonies, because they used to be a colony, so no, you don't have colonies. So one of the funny things we're going to be looking at is, well, what about all these bits and pieces that are American? Some are part of the United States, some aren't, some of them can vote, some can't. And the ones we tend to hear a lot about are Puerto Rico, and then the one in the Pacific that you will hear quite a lot about now, Guam. I'm going to, if we can switch to that, let's show you where these places are. Here. So there's Puerto Rico. Cuba was American. Oh, it's still called the Gulf of Mexico. Somebody hasn't changed it. Here's Guam. You might say, well, that's not very helpful. Where the heck is it? It's in the North Pacific. And you might say, well, why did the Americans hang on to it? It's a massive American military base. It's got a very big harbor for the Navy and a big Air Force base. And it was used particularly in the Second World War. Huge fight because the Japanese obviously occupied it and the Americans dislodged them. And it was used particularly during the American War in Vietnam. I use that term because my friends in Vietnam, that's what they call it. Well, I don't know what we call it, the Vietnam War, but Vietnamese look at it a bit differently. It's in the news now because it's within reach of Chinese missiles. But that's another issue. But you might sort of say, why did they want this? Why did they keep it after 1898? Because of its harbour, and we're coming to that. There are 2 other important harbours for the US Navy in the Pacific. We're going to be looking at how did they get hold of Hawaii and American Samoa, which most people wouldn't know where it is. That's when they got it. And they acquired the Philippines. And that's why Filipinos speak such good English. They occupied that until, obviously, the Japanese occupied it during the Second Pacific War. And then after the war, 1946, the Philippines got independence. So the Americans did pay Spain, but that's why these islands, and I've told you before how they got their name from Philip of Spain, here's Manila. And again, the importance of the big military bases there. So we're going to look at this role of the US Navy in the Pacific because it really is very, very important. So that was a significant war. But the point is that these places, Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines, they're not colonies. The US doesn't have colonies. Some of you have probably been reading this week how Trump is planning to go and meet Charles Windsor in London and apply to join the Commonwealth. And the big issue has come up, well, what is the Commonwealth? Aren't they just former British colonies? And Trump says, yes, they used to be a British colony. So they're eligible. And then the point is made, well, what about all these other countries that have recently joined the Commonwealth that were nothing to do with Britain? It's a curious interest. But the US itself, because of its history, doesn't have colonies. Here's Havana, the capital of Cuba, but the US didn't stay there, and that's when Cuba got independence. But of course, you've got this funny little, it's not on the map because we haven't got the whole of Cuba, just here, Guantanamo Bay. So they carved out this tiny little bit at the end of Cuba and kept it as US territory, and that's why they're deporting people there. So again, a bit of an anomaly. Cuba had to put up with the fact that this tiny little chunk, you can see it here, of Cuba is still US territory. But it isn't, which is why they can deport people. It's sort of no man's land. And that's where they've been shipping a lot of the so-called illegal terrorist immigrants, most of whom claim they're not. Who knows? And so you've got these other bits and pieces. Then you've got the Panama Canal zone. Well, we don't need a map of that. You know where the Panama Canal is. The guy who built the Suez Canal was quite keen to try and build a canal through. You've got to remember the late 19th century was the period of this enormous trade that was developing around the world with the development of steamships. The guy who built the Suez Canal also had a go at building a Panama Canal to cut the trip to Asia. They couldn't get around the Northwest Passage. They kept trying. We all know that's where Franklin ended up. He's still there, down there somewhere. It was quite significant, this exploration of the Northwest Passage. And we're going to come to that in a minute, or next week, because this is a big dispute between the US and Canada. Whose water is it north of Canada? If you go around the Northwest Passage, is it international water or Canadian waters? It's another of the disputes between Canada and the US that's making the Canadians very feisty. So in the end, the canal was started in 1904. It's 77 kilometers long, if you sort of want to know how long it is. And it took 10 years to build. An awful lot of people died building it. And they came up with this idea of the Panama Canal zone, sort of, which is a bit of territory either side of it. And of course, Trump doesn't forgive the late Jimmy Carter for giving it back to Panama. He wants to reclaim it along with Canada and Greenland. Another sort of little anomaly at this time, I've touched on it before, but it's worth mentioning, the Virgin Islands. There are two. There's the British Virgin Islands and the US Virgin Islands. But they used to be part of Denmark. And maybe that's where Trump got the idea of buying Greenland, because the US did buy the US Virgin Islands. Denmark was broke, 1917, and the US, I think they paid $25 million for it or something like that. It's actually 3 little islands. And I may have mentioned to you, because I'm always curious about where places get their names from. It's great fun in Tasmania is trying to find out where places get their names from. I may have mentioned it to you before, but Columbus called them the Virgin Islands after, any of you who are good Catholics may remember the story of St. Ursula and the 110,000 virgins, and that's where they got their name from. We hear about it a lot today because of Virgin Airways, and if you've been to Britain, Virgin Airlines and Virgin this and that. It's all tied up with Richard Branson, who owns one of the Virgin Islands as a personal estate. The other territories I wanted to touch on today were, how did they acquire Hawaii? Hawaii is a collection of islands. It was originally named the Sandwich Islands. Those of you who know the story of James Cook. Oh yeah, thanks, that's good. Because that's where he ran into trouble, of course, and the locals ate him, or bits of him. The islands were finally only put together as a kingdom in 1875. Became a monarchy, a Polynesian monarchy. I can't remember what I was reading the other day about the first people who actually climbed up Mauna Loa, the big volcano in Hawaii. It's supposed to be the tallest mountain in the world. If you go from the bottom of the sea to the top of the mountain, it's taller than Everest. Or to give Everest its correct name, it's got a Tibetan name and a Nepali name. Do any of you know who was Everest? Why is it called Mount Everest? Sorry, a bit of a... Yeah, he never went there. They named it after him because he was the Surveyor General. Yeah. But the Tibetan and the Nepali name is Goddess Mother of the World. And that's why you can't actually tread on the top. And that's why Edmund Hillary respected Sherpa Tenzing when they planted the flag. He didn't actually put his foot on the top. Anyway, sorry, that was a bit of a diversion. Why did the US get interested in the Hawaiian Islands? There were a couple of reasons. It was good for growing sugar and then later pineapples. It's the most southerly state. It's a good quiz question, that. Anyone asks you, which is the most southerly state in the United States? Most people will say Florida, but it isn't. It's Hawaii. The other interesting thing with Hawaii is the missionaries. And they became traders. They got into business. You've all probably read Hawaiian Pineapple and so on. The Navy, of course, their main interest was the harbour. So here we come to the harbour stories. There's Guam. There's Pearl Harbor, which is on the island of Oahu. But here's American Samoa. So we'll come to that in a minute. And then you've got a whole stack of tiny islands. Nobody lives there. And they're still disputed. And then next week we'll be looking at these islands here, the Northern Marianas. Wake Island's a bird sanctuary. Johnston Atoll is where the Americans stored all their chemicals after the American War in Vietnam. Again, they found an island. Here are all these islands. Nobody lives there. Occasionally people from Kiribati go and sort of collect coconuts there and dispute about them, but that's why you've got all these uninhabited islands in the Pacific that are claimed by the US. Britain claims some of them, so the one we want to look at is American Samoa. Samoa was, and the population there, if you want to know what the population is, about 47,000. There's not many people there. I had a stop off there on one of my trips across the Pacific. It's quite a curious place. The population is Polynesian, obviously. They're mostly Protestant because it was a target for the London Missionary Society, which had a very powerful interest in the Pacific, including Hawaii. All these islands are here as sort of part of what we call Polynesia, and then there's French Polynesia here. And I like this bit: United States exclusive economic zone, Great Lakes of the United States. The US Navy finally got it. Do you remember, I've told some of you in previous talks about the deal in the Congress of Berlin in the 1880s, and then the final breaking up of bits of Africa and the Pacific in 1899, which is when the US finally claimed American Samoa. It's what's called an unincorporated territory. So I told you that don't have colonies. What about the rest of Samoa? Well, it was German Samoa. And some of you probably know that at the end of the Great War, it was given to New Zealand as a trust territory. It was the first of the Pacific Islands to get independence in the 1970s. But American Samoa is still vital to the US Navy because it's spelled P-A-G-O, but it's pronounced Pango Pango. That's the base. When I was there, I was quite curious. I said, well, what do people here do for a living? Most of the young people join the US Marines. They're allowed to emigrate to the United States. There's a lot more American Samoans living in the west coast of the United States that live on American Samoa. And just a sort of anecdotal story, when I was on one of my trips to the United States, there's a big American submarine base here. This is where the home of the Trident submarine. The Trident submarine's the submarine that's got over 400 nuclear weapons on board, because each missile's got 17 nuclear warheads on it. They're monsters. They don't come here because they're nuclear. The ones who come here are the attack submarines, not the missile-carrying submarines. But that's where they were based. And when they were building it back in the 1970s, the base there, I was part of a protest group called the Pacific Life Community. And some of the group swam into the base and had a prayer meeting on the base. So they're standing on the base, and the Marines came rushing in. The alarms had gone off. Who were these intruders onto the submarine base? And the first guy who rushed up was an American Samoan. Did he arrest the naughty American Christians? No, he joined the prayer meeting. That was a lovely story. It's automatic because they're deeply religious people. The big problem they've got there is they live on junk food. Enormous problems with obesity on American Samoa because they've stopped sort of living off the ocean. It's a real tragedy. So you've got a tiny country, 47,000 people, as I said. So what do they do for a living? The women, you say, what do the women do? They work in a canning factory. There's not much work potential in a place like American Samoa. But the Americans hang on to it because they need those naval bases, Pearl Harbor, Guam, and American Samoa. So we come to the west coast of the United States, which was opening up around this time, as I told you. So if we go back to the west coast of the United States, please. Yeah. Yeah, the other one. Yeah, this one here. So this was sort of reached in the 1840s and then finally acquired from Mexico after the war between the US and Mexico, and then gradually sort of extended up, and the different states were created out of those bits. But what triggered it off was not only this idea of manifest destiny, that they had the right to move as far as the west coast, but also the famous gold rush. You know, you all sung the song about "Oh My Darling Clementine" and all that. And that, of course, had implications for Australia, because after the gold rush, one of the guys there realised that there was gold in Australia. The geology of New South Wales had gold potential, and sort of came over, found a bit of gold in New South Wales, and then the big rush when they discovered Victoria had even more, and that's when the state of Victoria had to be created. So there are, again, implications for Australia. Why is the West Coast so important? Because the US is suddenly facing the Pacific, and we're seeing the implications of that now, with the US moving its military focus from Europe to the Pacific. So this all began in the mid-19th century, and then the US Navy acquiring those bases in the Pacific, and it was all to do with trade. The importance of trade with Japan, which was opened up in the 1850s. Remember I told you that story about how the US sent the Black Fleet to Japan, and then the division, the treaty ports along the coast of China. The US didn't act like the European countries that had treaty ports, but it's still happy to trade. Then the great surge of the population, it's people moving across. Those of you who've been to Washington and Oregon know how really it's a beautiful place. Weather's much nicer. It's quite mild, well, milder than here. California, of course, has become the biggest state in terms of population. And the attraction, obviously the north is very different from the south. And a lot of the naval bases, here's San Diego, San Francisco, of course, was the center of the gold rush, and then you've got the famous redwood trees around here. I've spent a lot of time in California. It really is very beautiful, but of course, terrible problems here with the bushfires. So a lot of the forest has the same problems as we do. And of course, we all know that Trump hates California because they insist on voting Democrat. So the last bit I wanted to touch on So I said we're going up to the Great Wall, Alaska, and Hawaii. So Hawaii, I told you, there was a mixture of the missionaries, traders, growing sugar, the US Navy wanting Pearl Harbor. And of course, it's the one state in the United States where white people are a minority. The Asian population, if you call it that, 37%. It's a very fascinating place to go to. White population, 23%. And about 10% native Hawaiian. And there's still a Hawaiian sovereignty movement. But you don't hear much about it. And obviously with only 10% of the population, they're unlikely to get it. Because growing sugar and pineapples and so on attracted a lot of people from Japan, from the Philippines, from China and Korea. And so you've got this fascinating mixed population in Hawaii. And it was finally annexed in 1898. But didn't become a state till 1959. So what had happened was the last ruler of Hawaii was a queen. I can't pronounce her name, sorry, it's in the Hawaiian language and I can't get my tongue around it. But they overthrew the monarchy, 1893, as a group of American settlers overthrew it and then finally annexed it in 1898. So that's the story of Hawaii. Alaska, I've mentioned it to you before, but what happened there was the Russians had colonized it originally. The big interest there was trading in fur, the sea otter, that I talked about before. And the Americans, of course, came right down to California. And I told you it's a good place to visit for tourists, just north of San Francisco, a place called Fort Ross, which was the most distant Russian outpost. Well, they gave up, it was just too far away. But Alaska, they traded in 1867, $7.2 million. Well, it'd be a lot more today. And the Americans cursed the Secretary of State, Seward, called it Seward's Folly. And then, of course, later on, you had the gold rush and oil, and the people there who are indigenous, they don't count for the US interests. Became a state the same time as Hawaii, 1959. So it's obviously the biggest. Up here you've got the Arctic, very much affected by global warming. And this is the disputed area you're going to hear a lot more about, going around the Northwest Passage. And this is where Canada and the US are quarreling. Is this international waters or is it Canadian? And here, of course, is Greenland, which we'll probably hear a lot more about, and these fascinating islands. So this is a bone of contention. This bit isn't. So you've got big US bases. Here's the Aleutian Islands. They get their name from the Aleut people who live there. I told you before that people there are Russian Orthodox from the time that they were Russian for 300 years. Absolutely vital. Here's the Bering Strait. Vitus Bering, the Danish settler, explorer, and then this gap between the two, which is where the original population sort of crossed over and populated the Western Hemisphere when they could cross across there before you could sail across. So it's a fascinating little bit here between the two countries, between Russia and Alaska. So that's how they acquired Alaska, and not very heavily populated. You get a lot of tourist trips around here. Those of you interested in, I can't think of anything worse than going on a cruise, but a lot of people seem to like it. That's fine. But it's very beautiful, the fjords, the mountains. And the last thing I just wanted to touch on, again, what's the highest mountain in the United States? Ah, yes. Trump has renamed it. It's gone back to its original name. One of the last presidents in the 19th century in the United States was McKinley. He's one of the American presidents who got assassinated. But its indigenous name is Denali. And so it went back to the indigenous name. Trump's renamed it. So we hear about this becoming the Gulf of America, but the other place he renamed, he said, no, I'm not having any of this rubbish. about Native American names, it's going to be Mount McKinley again. So get out your official maps, you'll find Mount McKinley has reappeared as the highest mountain in the United States. Although, as I said to you, it's interesting that technically the highest mountain is here in Hawaii, if you go from the bottom of the sea to the top of the mountain. It's very, very deep. And of course the depths in the world is here off the Mariana Islands, which we'll have a look at next week. So that's how it was all finally sort of put together. Big issue now is, okay, they've got 50 states. What else are they going to co-opt? Maybe we can talk about that next week when we'll have a bit of time for discussion. Would they co-opt Canada? It's enormous, isn't it? It's the second biggest country after Russia. But the Canadians don't seem to like the idea. Okay, so I'll stop there because that seems to be a good cut-off point. What I want to look at next week, I'll just sort of round off and perhaps some time for discussion, is some of these islands here that were acquired at the end of the Second World War. It's quite important, looking at how they became part of the United States. Enormous implications today for the confrontation with China, and a vital role during the American War in Vietnam, and now in terms of big military bases. Quite interesting. And then the last bit, of course, people say, why the heck was Julian Assange tried on Saipan? So we'll find out about that next week too. Okay, so we're going to stop there. If anyone's got any questions, here you can see Puerto Rico and the US Virgin Islands. So there's Puerto Rico, just south of Cuba. There's Cuba. And there's the Virgin Islands. Yes?
So they're not part of the United States in a way that they can support, or they are part of it. Why is Trump so orderly to do it, and everybody kind of runs out of water up there? What's the situation?
Well, I told you all these different little bits and pieces, they've all got different names. Some of them are allowed to emigrate to the United States. Puerto Ricans are allowed to. There's a big Puerto Rican population, particularly New York and Florida and so on. But they're not a state, so they can't vote. So you've got all these in between. We're going to look at some more when we look at the Pacific Islands next week, these in between bits and pieces, some of which are part of the United States, some of which they call unincorporated territories. Some can vote, some can't. Some can emigrate to the United States, some can't. So there's all this because they don't have colonies. Yes?
When you look at the Northwest Passage, you see the plenty of Canadian islands up there. I think it's indisputable. Has it ever been disputed before?
Well, I mean, Canada was only sort of came into existence really in the 19th century, and they didn't know a lot of the islands were there. There's a lot of interesting stories about all the names they've got around here, about, and some of you may have read about that ghastly film that they made recently in Denmark about those two guys who had to prove that Greenland wasn't part of Canada and that there was water between the two, and they were stuck there for 2 years in this cabin, somehow survived. It's an amazing film. So it was all claimed by Canada in the end of the 19th century. But the question is, the water that goes through it, is that international waters or Canadian waters? Canada says it's Canadian, Trump says it isn't. But this is where global warming kicks in, because now they can get through in the summer, and it's increasing with the ice is melting, and that's how they discovered Sir John Franklin. He's somewhere around there. His ship's still down there, he's still down there, but they managed to locate it because of global warming. The ice is melting. And it's going to be fairly serious implications, because it will enable Europe to trade much more quickly with China and Japan and Korea than all the way sort of round that way. And you might say, well, so what? It's all to do with the fuel on these massive ships. if you can cut the time it takes to trade between East Asia and Europe, you save a heck of a lot of money. And that's why it's so important. Yeah?
Oklahoma, I believe, originally was an Indian territory.
Oh, it all was.
Yeah. And this wonderful American dream in the musical Oklahoma
Oh, yeah.
contrasts with when they suddenly opened it up, I suppose, in 1907, and this land rush
Yep.
to grab some patch of land. But, you know, in the film, there's no, apart from the fact there's no black man, there's no Native Americans in it.
That's the one thing I haven't talked about, was the way the Native American population was sort of moved, and particularly the Trail of Tears, when the whole East Coast population was shoved across. And then particularly the war with the Lakota people and so on, because I didn't see it as sort of central to the construction of the United States, but basically all the territory was just taken. The difference with Australia, most of you realise this, they did sign treaties. And that's what they're still arguing about. Australia is the one place they never signed any treaties, which has made a huge difference in terms of the relationship between the settler population and the indigenous people. The sad thing is that I visited quite a few of the so-called reservations when I was there. Incredibly depressing. Total unemployment. But some of them have become very rich because they've built casinos, which is a bit like the argument we had here. So some of them have become quite prosperous. Then they've discovered a lot of minerals on them, particularly uranium. So they got rich that way. But I told you also about New Mexico and the test site and there. So that's the Shoshone people. They lost out when that territory was taken away. But that whole story with the indigenous population I didn't touch on, but it's something worth sort of looking at if you're really interested. Yes?
How can Trump think he can play Canada with that?
Well, if I knew how Trump's mind worked, Canada, he just says, is a US state. But of course, Canada and the US have fought each other when it was British, the 1812 war. I don't know how many of you realise that White House is called the White House because after the British bombed it, it had to be painted, get rid of the marks. That's why it's the White House. Well, he claims the Panama Canal because the Americans built it, and he says Jimmy Carter shouldn't have given it back. But that's why I've explained how the US got put together, all these bits and pieces that they took by force or they purchased. And I said, in the case of Denmark, they bought the Virgin Islands, so why shouldn't they buy Greenland? Trump says geologically it's part of the United States. And this is where you've got Monroe Doctrine. The Western Hemisphere is a US sphere of interest. I remember I once hitchhiked from the west coast of the US to the east coast, and I started out in the US, and it got so scary that I actually went up to Canada and hitchhiked across Canada instead, and then dropped back into Maine. It's a different world. It really is fascinating. It took me a week, same as it took me hitching from Perth to Sydney in the days when you hitchhiked. Yes?
When Stuart bought
Alaska,
he also had a proposal to take Greenland. So,
I didn't know that. Okay.
and what happened was he got involved, they were going to have both Greenland and Alaska, and then Stuart got involved in impeachment.
Yeah.
And they completed Alaska, but they didn't complete Greenland. They got confused with their own internal politics. They sort of put it to one side. And all Trump's done is really the claim, the proposal that Stewart
Oh, thank you for that. I didn't know that. Yep, it's quite possible. So I took this. Well, we talked a little bit about the story of Greenland last week, why it's part of Denmark. First of all, in the days when they used to exile people, Ingolfur Arnason got sent to Iceland in 874, and then they kicked out Eric the Red, so he went off to Greenland and called it Greenland, hoping that other people would come and live there, hence the name Greenland, which it isn't. And it was his son, Leif Erikson, who got blown into what is now Labrador. Then you got the famous Greenland settlement. So it all goes back to what we call the Middle Ages. That's why it's a Danish colony. And of course now, again, global warming, they can get access to the mineral wealth in Greenland, as well as the fact that it's strategically part of NATO, and that the US has still got a big base up there where they keep an eye on missiles flying from Russia across the pole to North America. So I suppose Trump says he wants it for strategic reasons and the mineral wealth. So it seems we're going back to trade, If you've got the resources, I want it. Yes?
With the Arctic Ocean melting, how much of that area is being claimed by Russia?
Well, that's another. Well, we haven't got a map of Russia, but it's international water, sort of north of Russia. But they've got a number of those islands, and of course, the interesting one there is Svalbard or Spitsbergen, which the Norwegians have always let the Russians have a little bit of to mine coal, and they've got an interesting relationship there. But they're very worried about it now, and that's partly why Norway's a member of NATO. So you've got that. But I don't think it's... The Russians sort of claim the area off the coast, but they don't claim the whole Arctic Ocean. And there's a lot of... But again, because of global warming, it's much easier to get across there. The big issue there is an interesting one. Who's got icebreakers? Which countries have got icebreakers? And that's where Canada, Russia, the United States, some have got more icebreakers than the others. They're fiendishly expensive to build. The Russian ones are nuclear powered. Yeah?
And Trump has announced that he's going to keep 40 icebreakers,
Yeah.
preparing for
That means they won't be able to build our submarines, won't they? Yeah. Okay, well, keep you. That's a great map. Thank you.